On the big day, Victoria, the cold stepmother, has arranged for her stepdaughter, Olivia, to be engaged to Ethan, a street beggar, in order to lower her social status. The event takes place on New York's bustling Fifth Avenue, where everyone is horrified by Ethan's revelation. Ethan, a 28-year-old with disheveled hair and tattered clothes, sits exhausted on the sidewalk. His once bright blue eyes are now dulled by fatigue and hunger. His ribs, visible under his tattered shirt, testify to weeks of not having eaten. Ethan watches the bustling crowd around him, feeling invisible in the crowd. His stomach growls painfully, reminding him that he hasn't eaten in more than 2 days. Just one more day, Ethan, and you can make it. Someone will notice today, he tells himself, trying to hold on to hope. I'm kidding myself. No one stops to look closely at a beggar. A bitter inner voice echoed in his head. Time passed slowly. And Ethan fought the temptation to rummage through the surrounding trash bins in search of leftovers. He had promised himself he wouldn't stoop to that level, but hunger was relentless. His eyes followed every person who passed by with a bag of food or a cup of coffee. The aroma of hot dogs being sold on the street corner tickling his senses, making his mouth water and his stomach growl. Maybe I should try the shelter again, but I can't. Ethan quivered, leaving the thought unfinished. Why did it have to be like this? I wish I didn't have to grow up like this. I wish I had a family, a home. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan's desperation grew. He watched other homeless people approach pedestrians for money, but he didn't dare do the same. His pride, the only thing he had left, prevented him from stepping forward. An older man sat not far away, looking at Ethan with a mixture of pity and understanding. Little man, sometimes things seem hopeless, but we survive, he said, his voice hoarse from age and life on the streets. I know, but sometimes it feels like life on the streets will never change. We only have a few pennies from kind people, but we need more job opportunities, housing to get out of here, and healthy food on the table. Ethan replied, his voice trembling between hope and disbelief. Unexpectedly, as if the universe had heard his silent plea, a middle-aged woman stopped in front of Ethan without a word. She handed him a paper bag containing a still warm sandwich, the aroma of fresh bread and grilled meat wafting into his nostrils, making his stomach flutter with anticipation. Ethan looked up at the woman, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Mom. I don't know what you were thinking, he said, his voice choked with emotion. The woman simply smiled gently and continued walking, leaving Ethan stunned by the act of kindness. Maybe there is still kindness in this world. Maybe I'm not completely alone, Ethan thought, feeling a glimmer of hope in his heart. As he prepared to enjoy his precious sandwich, his eyes caught sight of 2 other men sitting nearby, their gaunt faces and hungry eyes mirroring his own. Without hesitation, Ethan divided the sandwich into 3, handing it to those in similar circumstances. Hey guys, let's share. No one should go hungry when we can help each other, he said, his voice choked with kindness. On the opposite side of the street, 2 women were watching the scene. Olivia, a young girl with long brown hair and compassionate blue eyes, felt her heart ache at the act of kindness. She took a step toward the sidewalk, determined to help more when she felt a tug on her arm. Victoria, Olivia's stepmother, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression and cold gaze, gripped her arm harshly. Don't even think about it, Olivia. I won't let you associate with those people, Victoria hissed, her gray eyes blazing with anger. But Victoria, they need help. How can we ignore them? Olivia protested, her voice shaking with emotion and indignation. Victoria pulled Olivia away from the scene, her high heels clicking on the sidewalk as they headed toward a fancy store. The contrast between the glittering store windows and the harsh reality of the street was stark. Olivia remained resolute, her gaze still fixed on Ethan and his companions. Victoria stopped abruptly, turning to her stepdaughter-in-law with a face contorted with disgust and suppressed rage. Are you out of your mind, Olivia? These people are dangerous. They can spend any money you give them on drugs or alcohol, Victoria hissed, her voice cutting and unforgiving. You don't. No, Olivia replied, her voice shaking with indignation. That man just shared what may be the only meal he's had today. How can you be so insensitive? The bickering between the 2 women drew curious glances from passers-by. Olivia, usually reserved, felt a rare surge of courage grow within her. She jerked free of Victoria's grasp and walked determinedly toward the street. They're people, Victoria. They deserve compassion, not judgment, Olivia said, her voice growing stronger. Victoria gripped Olivia's hand again, her scarred nails digging into the girl's skin. "You don't understand how the world works, dear. These people have chosen this way of life. It's not our responsibility to save them," Victoria argued, her tone contemptuous. "No one chooses to starve or live on the streets. How could you be so blind?" Olivia counted the tears of disappointment glistening in her eyes, firmly stepping out of Victoria's grasp before she could stop her. She quickly crossed the street, walking towards Ethan and his companions with trembling hands. Olivia took out a few bills from her wallet. "Take this. I hope it helps," she said, handing Ethan the money. The young man looked at Olivia, surprised and touched by the gesture. Their eyes met in a silent moment, a quiet connection between two souls. "Thank you." "Your kindness means more than you think," Ethan replied, his voice choked with emotion. "It's nothing, I just wish I could do more," Olivia whispered, feeling both relieved and helpless at their plight. Victoria watched the scene from a distance, her face a mixture of anger and something else, as if calculating a plan. Her gray eyes narrowed, focusing on Ethan. There was something about him, something beyond his shabby appearance, that made Victoria begin to form a plan that could solve many of her problems at once. Olivia returned to the sidewalk, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with her stepmother. But surprisingly, Victoria didn't scream or scolded her immediately. Instead, a cold smile appeared on her lips. "Then, since you insist on associating with these people, perhaps I should teach you a lesson about them, shouldn't I?" Victoria suggested, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What are you going to do, Olivia?" Victoria and Olivia slowly backed away, but Olivia suddenly felt anxious about her stepmother's change in attitude. As they walked away, Victoria turned back to look at Ethan once more. Her eyes were sparkling with cold determination, an idea clearly forming in her calculating mind. Olivia was still confused by Victoria's sudden change, not noticing the look as she was lost in thought, recalling her brief encounter with Ethan. There was something about him, a dignified and kind quality, that was completely at odds with the dangerous circumstances he was in. "That young man, there's something different about him, don't you think?" Victoria commented casually, her voice filled with concern that sent a chill down Olivia's spine. "Why the sudden concern?" "A few minutes ago, you wanted me to ignore him completely," Olivia replied, unable to hide the doubt in her voice. When they reached the castle, Victoria burst through the door, her high heels echoing in the grand marble hallway. Olivia followed quietly, still confused about the afternoon's events. Robert, alerted by the noisy presence, emerged from his office with a worried look on his face. "Robert, her daughter is out of control today. She almost interacts with beggars on the street." Victoria wasted no time in greeting. Robert looked from Victoria to Olivia, his face a mixture of confusion and disappointment. "Olivia, is this true?" he asked, his voice a tired fatherly one. "I was just trying to help someone in need. I don't see anything wrong with that," Olivia replied, her voice shaking but firm in her conviction. Victoria grabbed Robert's arm, pulling him into the office and closing the door, leaving Olivia outside. The sound of arguing echoed through the solid wood walls. "Don't you see the danger here, Robert? She is ruining our reputation by associating with the worst of society," Victoria said indignantly, her eyes flashing with anger. Robert sank down into the leather chair, his hand touching his face in a tired gesture. "Victoria, she has a good heart, we cannot criticize her for that." "A good heart in this world is a weakness, we cannot allow it," Victoria replied, her voice as sharp as a knife. The argument escalated as Victoria listed all of Olivia's wrongdoings over the past few months: unapproved charity donations, volunteer work in the slums, refusal to attend proper social events. Robert listened, his face growing paler. "She is ruining everything we have built, our social standing, our relationships, everything is at stake because of her obsession with helping the less fortunate more." Victoria continued in an angry whisper, "But she's my daughter, Robert, I can't change her." Robert protested, his voice already showing signs of frustration. "Victoria, I can't just stand by and watch her be destroyed. Her happiness is just as important." Victoria stopped, stood still, and turned to face Robert with a dangerous determination in her eyes. "I have a plan," she announced, her voice suddenly calm and controlled. "A plan that will solve two problems at once." Robert sat back in his chair, instantly sober. He knew Victoria's voice was often not good. What plan, he asked cautiously, fearing the outcome. I want to teach Olivia a lesson. A way to make her understand that not everyone is as good as she thinks, Victoria replied with a cold smile on her lips. The atmosphere in the office became heavy and oppressive. Robert looked at Victoria with a mixture of fear and curiosity, knowing that he should protest to protect his daughter, but the years of Victoria's manipulation and control had worn away at his resolve. What are you going to do? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Victoria moved closer, her eyes glinting with near madness. Ethan is so eager to help others. What if we used him to show Olivia that people like him aren't as good as you think, if she had to witness their evil firsthand? Robert felt a chill run down his spine. Victoria, what are you talking about? Victoria stood abruptly, her presence casting a menacing shadow over Robert. We're going to force Olivia to marry him, she announced, her voice filled with cruel satisfaction. Robert couldn't believe his ears. You're out of your mind, Victoria. That's horrible, he shouted. That's terrible. No, unrequited love is a necessary lesson, Victoria replied, her voice calculating and cold. There's no better way to teach Olivia the harsh realities of the world than to force her to live with someone like him. Robert began to pace wearily in the office, running his hand through his thinning silver hair in a gesture of desperation. But what about her happiness? My daughter deserves better, he argued, his voice firm despite his obvious concern. Victoria turned back, her gaze unwavering. Her happiness? We're talking about your daughter's future. Imagine the looks and whispers at social events. Olivia needs to understand the consequences of her thoughtless actions. Robert sighed, feeling the heavy pressure from Victoria's suggestion. Victoria, my Olivia would never be ashamed of such a simpleton. Besides, she has a good heart, she won't be affected by this. Victoria laughed coldly, her voice echoing throughout the office. Oh, Robert, do you really think she can handle it? Good-hearted as she is still a girl raised in luxury. A few days with that beggar, and she will be apologizing for her stupidity. Robert bowed his head, feeling the weight of Victoria's offer clearly on his shoulders. How are we going to convince him to join, he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. We'll offer him a sum of money he can't refuse. Given his situation, it will be an irresistible offer, Victoria replied, her voice dripping with confidence. A stifling silence filled the office. Robert stared into space, his mind a jumble of conflicting emotions, paternal love and concern for Olivia's well-being, battling with fear of the potential social consequences. He knew that this decision would change everything, but would he have the strength to resist Victoria's manipulation? Victoria looked straight into Robert's eyes, her gaze unwavering. Think carefully, Robert. This is what's best for Olivia's future. Robert sighed deeply, feeling the pressure gradually taking over him. He knew that Victoria wouldn't change her mind easily once she had made up her mind. With an undisguised weariness, he reluctantly agreed, hoping that he could salvage the situation before it was too late. Victoria smiled slightly, feeling her victory. Meanwhile, Olivia was still standing outside the door, unaware of what was about to happen, only feeling the tension and change in the atmosphere in her family. Robert sighed, looking at Victoria with concern. I don't know, Victoria. This seems like a step too far. Can't we just talk to her, he muttered doubtfully. Victoria moved closer, her voice soft but firm. My dear, words aren't enough. Olivia needs to see for herself. Sometimes we have to be strong to protect the ones we love, she argued, her voice a mixture of conviction and false compassion. Robert argued back, his eyes betraying his inner struggle. Yes, but forcing a marriage, playing with my daughter's life like this, there has to be another way. He rose from his seat, walked to the window and looked out at the world outside, a complicated world full of traps for his beloved daughter. Sighing deeply, he turned back to Victoria. This will not end well, Victoria. You underestimate Olivia and the power of her trust. Victoria crossed her arms, her eyes flashing with frustration. Your hesitation is why Olivia is losing control. Sometimes we have to make tough decisions. You are her father, you have to teach her how to protect her reputation, she said in a firm voice. The sun was starting to set over the city park, dyeing the sky a brilliant orange and pink. Meanwhile, Ethan sat on an old bench, watching the people passing by. An elegant figure approached him, Victoria in a designer coat and high heels, looking out of place in this simple space. She stopped in front of Ethan, her cold eyes appraising him from head to toe. "Are you the beggar here?" "I am Victoria, Olivia's stepmother, the one who helped you and is staying with me." Ethan stood up, confused and slightly defensive. "Yes, I am. My name is Ethan." "What do you need, ma'am?" His voice was hoarse from lack of use. "I have a proposition for you, one that could change your life forever," Victoria announced with a calculating smile on her face. She quickly laid out her plan for Ethan, explaining the arranged marriage to Olivia, promising him a life of luxury and comfort in exchange for his cooperation. Ethan listened, his eyes widening at every word she spoke. "Are you asking me to marry your stepdaughter-in-law, the kind woman who helped you today, for money?" he asked in surprise. Victoria nodded, her smile never fading. "Think about it, Ethan. You won't have to worry about food or shelter anymore. You'll have everything you've ever dreamed of," she insisted, her voice as seductive as a snake's. "I can't accept this. I can't use someone like that, especially someone who's been so good to me," Ethan replied, shaking his head in refusal. His refusal seemed to upset Victoria, but she kept her cool, changing tactics. "Think of the possibilities, Ethan. With this money you could help so many people, your friends on the streets, people who go hungry every day," she suggested, her voice soft and persuasive. Ethan hesitated, his hands clenching into fists as he considered her words. Images of his friends on the streets, hungry and desperate, flashed through his mind. "I could really make a difference," he muttered, rather than addressing Victoria. "Imagine how many lives you could change. Isn't that what Olivia would do? Use her resources to help others." Victoria sensed Ethan's hesitation and pressed on. His eyes slid over her jacket, stopping at a gold medallion pinned to her buttonhole, an intricate design with a rose wrapped around a vine. A distant memory from Ethan's childhood suddenly flooded his mind. "This medal. I've seen it before," he said, trembling with sudden emotion. Victoria backed away, surprised by his reaction. "Just an old family heirloom, nothing important," she said quickly, her hand covering the medal. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the strange familiarity of the medal and Victoria's odd request. "I hope I'm doing the right thing, but if this can help someone else, maybe it's worth it," he told himself, his fingers tapping his knee nervously. A few minutes later, Victoria's luxury car glided past the mansion gates, the large house coming into view before Ethan. He sat in the back seat, looking awed by the grandeur of the building. Olivia, who had been reading by her bedroom window, heard the sound of the car and looked out curiously. Her eyes widened in shock as Ethan stepped out of the car, looking lost and worried in his tattered clothes. "What's going on? Why did Victoria bring that man here? This can't be good. What did she do to him?" she wondered, confused and worried. Victoria led Ethan into the house, her eyes fixed on Olivia, who was watching from the window. "Wait here," she instructed, leaving him in the great hall. She climbed the stairs with determination, knocking on Olivia's bedroom door before walked in without waiting for a reply. "Olivia, we need to talk," Victoria announced in a fake sweet voice. Olivia turned around, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. "Victoria, what's going on? Why is that man here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Victoria answered, her voice full of fake concern. "Everything will become clear soon enough, but first, sit down. We have a lot to discuss." She gestured for Olivia to sit on the edge of the bed, and Olivia reluctantly complied, her eyes never leaving Victoria's face. The stepmother began pacing the room, her high heels clicking on the wooden floor. "Your obsession with helping the less fortunate has been worrying my father and I. We've decided it's time you learned a valuable lesson about the real world," Victoria began, her voice full of fake concern. Olivia felt a knot forming in her stomach. "What are you talking about, Victoria?" she asked, fearing the answer. "I'm talking about consequences, dear, and marriage," Victoria replied with a cold smile on her face. The shock hit Olivia like a punch in the gut, and she stood up abruptly, her hands shaking. "Marriage? What marriage?" she demanded, her voice rising an octave. Victoria stopped, turning to face Olivia directly. "I will marry the beggar down there, Ethan, who I was so eager to help today," she announced, savoring every word. Olivia felt the blood drain from her face, the situation becoming chaotic. "This is crazy. "You can't be serious," she shouted, her voice echoing throughout the room. Victoria stood there, holding her ground, while Olivia wrestled with her emotions, knowing that the real battle was just beginning. Victoria looked at Olivia with a cold gaze, her threatening voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But honey, I'm serious. Before you even think about refusing, let me explain the consequences of your failure to cooperate." Olivia backed away, sitting heavily on the bed, her mind racing as she tried to process the absurdity of the situation. "I was just helping a man in need. What did I do wrong? You can't force me to do this. It's illegal and immoral," she argued, tears of frustration starting to roll down her cheeks. Victoria moved closer, crouching down to face Olivia directly. "I can and will do this, honey, unless you want to see your new beggar friend face serious charges. It would be a shame if the police found anything illegal in his possession, wouldn't it?" Every word she spoke was laced with malice. "I won't do it. He's innocent. He had nothing to do with this," Olivia stammered, fear gripping her heart as reality began to creep into her mind. "Why would you do this, Victoria? What do you gain from all this?" Victoria smiled coldly, straightening her body. "What do I gain? My dear, Olivia is a daughter-in-law who finally understands her place in the family and society. You will learn that your actions have consequences, and that not everyone you try to help is worthy of your compassion." Olivia felt trapped in the corner, her eyes darting out the window where she had seen Ethan arrive earlier. The thought of him suffering because of her was unbearable, and if I accept, what will happen to Ethan? She asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "He will have a comfortable life, away from the streets, and you, my dear, will learn a valuable lesson about the real world." Victoria replied in a voice that was almost motherly yet cold enough to make Olivia shiver. Ethan was led into a luxurious bathroom attached to his new room. His eyes widened at the sight of the large marble bathtub and the toiletries neatly arranged on the counter. "Everything you need is here," the housekeeper pointed to the soft towels and shaving products. Ethan nodded, still in shock at the situation. Once alone, he turned on the hot water, filling the tub. "How long has it been since my last real bath?" he said to himself, slowly stripping away his tattered clothes. "Will all the dirt come off? Do I even remember how to bathe properly?" He wondered, a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Ethan stepped into the hot water, unable to hold back a sigh of satisfaction. Years of grime began to melt away as he vigorously scrubbed with a soft sponge and fragrant soap. He dipped his head into the water, rinsing it over and over. The water quickly turned cloudy, a silent testament to his years on the streets. Ethan stayed in the tub until it cooled, savoring every moment of cleanliness and comfort. "It's like being reborn," he whispered, looking at clean skin for the first time in years. Wrapped in a soft towel, Ethan looked into the dim mirror, his long, messy beard obscuring much of his face. With shaking hands, he took out his razor and shaving cream, carefully trimming the beard, revealing a face he had forgotten. Each stroke of the blade stripped away not only the hair, but also the layers of life on the streets. When he was done, Ethan could barely recognize the man in the mirror. "Oh my God, is that really me?" he whispered, touching his smooth cheek. "It's like looking at a stranger from the past." In his newly prepared clothes, Ethan felt like an imposter. The soft, tailored fabric was a stark contrast to the ragged clothes he was used to. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, feeling uncomfortable with the feeling of being well-dressed. Taking one last look in the mirror, Ethan took a deep breath to prepare himself to face everyone. "You can do it. With a life like this, you'll be able to help a lot of people," he said to his reflection, trying to convince himself. As he descended the stairs, Ethan felt all eyes on him. Olivia stood at the bottom of the stairs, gasping when she saw him, their eyes meeting, and for a moment, the world stopped. "Ethan, I almost didn't recognize you," she whispered, her voice a mixture of surprise and something else he couldn't quite place. Victoria appeared, casting Ethan a contemptuous glance. "Oh, wonderful. I see you cleaned up well," she said in a fake cheerful tone. Ethan nodded, unable to find a response as they moved toward the dining room. He couldn't help but notice Olivia's eyes lingering. "What are you thinking?" Ethan wondered, feeling exposed in a way that life on the street never had. The days passed in a whirlwind of preparation and mounting tension. Sitting in the chair of the fancy salon, Olivia looked into the mirror as her hairdresser worked on her intricate wedding style. Her eyes, though sad, still gleaming with silent determination. Her hand rested lightly on the white dress in her palm. She couldn't help but think of Ethan and the extraordinary changes he had undergone in the past few days. He must feel as lost as I do, she thought to herself. Maybe this marriage is his real chance to help him, to make the difference I've always wanted to make. The hairdresser noticed Olivia's thoughtful expression and tried to lighten the mood with a friendly conversation. "Are you excited for the big day, miss?" she asked softly. Olivia hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's complicated, but I'm determined to make the best of the situation," she said, her eyes meeting the mirror in the mirror, her mind wandering to the moments she and Ethan had shared over the past few days, the hesitant conversations, the shy smiles, the obvious gratitude in his eyes. "He deserves a chance to rebuild his life, and perhaps together we can find a greater purpose in this situation," Olivia mused. As the hairdresser finished her hairdo, Olivia watched the activity in the salon through the mirror, thinking about all the people out there who needed help like Ethan. Her mind began to form plans, ways to use her position and resources to make a difference, even within the confines of an arranged marriage. "Are you happy with the results?" Miss the hairdresser asked, interrupting her thoughts. "It was wonderful, thank you," Olivia replied, this time with a genuine smile. This could be the start of something important, she added in her mind, feeling a wave of determination wash over her. At that moment, Olivia heard a snippet of a conversation between two nearby employees. "That's Victoria's stepdaughter? Remember that scandal involving her stepmother?" one whispered. The other nodded and leaned closer. "How could I forget? They said she was involved in something terrible, though no one could prove it." However, the conversation came to an abrupt halt when the women noticed Olivia's eyes in the mirror. They quickly backed away, looking guilty. Olivia's heart pounded, sensing that something terrible was going on. What had Victoria been involved in? Sometimes Olivia wondered if she was really who she claimed to be. She said she loved being in our family, but acted like she hated Olivia. Olivia's mind was in turmoil, the staff's words echoing in her head, combined with her observations of the past few days, especially Victoria's reluctance to discuss her past before her marriage to Robert. There was a piece of the puzzle there, and Olivia was determined to decipher it. She walked to the salon window. The reflection in the glass was not just a bride, but a woman with a purpose. "I will find out. If Victoria is hiding something, I will find out," Olivia promised herself, her expression determined. Now the story was more complicated than ever. The afternoon sun shone brightly on the majestic facade of the church as a line of luxury cars began to arrive. Ethan, wearing a suit that still felt unfamiliar to him, watched anxiously from the entrance. The guests, members of the upper class, stepped out of their cars with curious and judgmental eyes fixed on him. Whispers and small talk rang out, words like beggar and scandal clear in Ethan's ears, his stomach churning, the reality of the situation finally waking him up violently. "How did I get here? Why are these people looking at me with such disgust?" Does Olivia think the same way? He said to himself, adjusting his tie for the 100th time, his eyes searching the crowd for a friendly face. An elderly couple walked past Ethan, the woman unable to hide her disgust. "I heard Victoria said you lived on the streets until last week." "What a disgrace to Olivia," she whispered loud enough for Ethan to hear. The man beside her nodded, his eyes scornfully directed at Ethan. "They say it's some kind of punishment, but to expose the family like this, combined with people like you, Olivia must have lost her mind," he replied. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face, realizing that Victoria had deliberately spread his story, making him a phenomenon to humiliate Olivia in front of everyone. "So I'm just a tool to humiliate Olivia? Why was I so naive?" he thought, anger and shame mingling in his heart. As the guests continued to arrive, each glance and whisper only added to Ethan's discomfort. He saw Victoria from afar, greeting the guests with a fake smile, occasionally throwing smug glances his way. Ethan clenched his fists, trying not to confront her right there. Just then, a hand gently touched his shoulder, startling him. It was Robert, Olivia's father, his eyes full of pity and guilt. "Ethan, I'm sorry for all this," he whispered, his voice weak before Ethan could reply. Robert had already left, swept away by the crowd. Even your father was a victim in this dark game, Ethan thought, his mind reeling. An old man leaning on an ornamental cane approached Ethan, his eyes widening as he recognized him. "It can't be you," he whispered, studying Ethan's features closely. In that moment, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope, thinking that perhaps he wasn't judging him for being homeless. The old man looked around nervously, as if afraid someone would see him, then leaned closer to Ethan. "Son, I need to talk to you right away, in private." "It's urgent," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. Ethan nodded slowly, surprised and curious. "Of course, sir. But what's the matter?" he asked, his voice low and worried. The old man glanced around once more before replying, "Not here. Meet me behind the church in 5 minutes. There's something you need to know," and then quickly left in a hurried pace. Ethan stood still, his heart pounding, the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together, but the picture that formed was more complicated and intriguing than he'd imagined. What's going on here? Who is this man and what does he have to tell me? He thought, his mind racing with countless possibilities. Not long after the old man revealed everything, Ethan returned inside the church. The atmosphere was tense as the guests took their seats. Standing in the sanctuary, his heart pounding in his chest, the old man's revelations still fresh in his mind. He anxiously watched the entrance to the church, determined to carry out his plan for Olivia, despite the whirlwind of emotions that were swirling around him. Although the pastor saw Ethan's tense expression and whispered, "Is everything okay, boy?" Ethan just nodded, his teeth clenched with determination. "I need to be strong. Olivia deserves to know the truth. But not like that, like this. Not here. I won't give her up at the wedding," he thought, feeling the weight of the new knowledge. "It's all right, Reverend," he replied, and then the music began. Everyone turned toward the church entrance, Olivia radiant in her wedding dress, but her eyes told a story of fear and determination. Each step she took down the aisle felt like she was carrying a heavy burden, like she was walking toward an uncertain fate. Victoria sat in the front row, her smile of satisfaction now turning cruel to Ethan. If she knew what I know, how things would change when the truth came out, Ethan thought, his eyes fixed on Olivia. When Olivia finally reached the altar, her eyes met Ethan's in a moment of understanding. A silent connection between two souls, united against a greater force. Reverend Mitchell began the service, his voice echoing through the church, but to Ethan, the words seemed distant. Great, overwhelmed by the weight of the secret he carried. "Hold fast, Ethan. All will be revealed in due time," he told himself. The service continued, each word the minister spoke adding to the tension in the air. Finally, the decisive moment arrived. "If anyone has any reason why this marriage should not take place, speak now or forever hold your peace," the minister announced, a heavy silence falling over the church. Ethan felt his body tense, the truth he had discovered burning in his throat, calling out. He fought to keep from speaking, knowing that there was a larger plan at work. At that moment, to everyone's surprise, Victoria stood up abruptly. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Ethan's heart nearly stopped, his eyes widening in shock. "What are you doing? Do you know that I've discovered the truth?" He thought, panic starting to creep into his mind. Victoria walked towards the main aisle of the church, her high heels echoing in the stunned silence. A cruel smile spread across her face as she stood before everyone, at the side of the sanctuary. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice full of fake sweetness. "I believe everyone deserves to know the truth about this marriage." Her eyes shifted to Olivia, who stood frozen, her face pale with shock. This young woman, Victoria continued to point at the bride, thought she could challenge her social status by mingling with the lowlifes of the streets. Indeed, this was the result of her foolish compassion. Olivia felt tears welling up in her eyes but resolutely refused to let them fall. "Victoria, please don't do this," she whispered in a trembling voice. "It's not too late." Victoria replied in a voice as sharp as a knife, "You brought yourself into this situation." She turned to the entire assembly, opening her arms in a dramatic gesture. "Friends, this is the bride who chose to marry a beggar, a man who until last week lived on the streets, dirty and hungry." Words of shame and disapproval rippled through the church. Ethan stood still, his fists clenched, anger boiling in his veins. Victoria continued her merciless speech. "This is what happens when someone forgets their place, when they refuse to respect the traditions and expectations of our society." Finally, Robert stood up, his voice shaking with rage. "Victoria, enough. How could you do this to my daughter?" he demanded indignantly. "My sister." Victoria laughed, her voice cold and humorless, has chosen this path. Now she must face the consequences. Olivia's face flushed with shame, but her eyes changed, a spark of determination replacing her initial shock. She stepped toward Victoria, ready to confront her, but before she could say anything, Ethan moved. He stepped forward, standing between Victoria and Olivia, his eyes blazing, silencing everyone. "Enough of your lies, Victoria," he said, his voice low but firm. The entire church held its breath. Victoria took a step back, surprised by Ethan's sudden intervention. "What do you think you're doing?" She narrowed her eyes, her control beginning to falter. Ethan looked Victoria straight in the eye, years of secrets and conspiracies about to be exposed. "Tell me the truth you've kept hidden for so long," he replied, his voice growing stronger. The silence in the church grew heavy as Ethan stepped closer, taking a deep breath, gathering the strength to reveal what he was about to say. "When the time comes, the truth will come out, Victoria. You think you can bury the past, but it always finds a way to resurface. My real name is Hudson Howard. Although it may sound strange to me now that I've been using a street name for so many years, this is my baptismal name. I am the son of Jonathan Howard, your first husband." A few minutes ago, an old man had approached him. He told me a story that, although I can't remember it clearly, is deeply ingrained in my mind. He talked about a child, the son of a wealthy man who had mysteriously disappeared many years ago. That child was me. He recognized the scar I had, the same one he had seen on Jonathan Howard's son before he had mysteriously disappeared. But when he learned my story on the street, he connected all the dots. "Victoria, you were my father's second wife. When he died under mysterious circumstances, you inherited everything, but that wasn't enough. I was the legitimate heir, threatening your newfound status and wealth, so you decided to change our lives forever. You abandoned me in a nearby town, erasing my existence from the careful life you had built. I was too young to remember much, and everyone believed your lies about my disappearance. All these years on the streets, I don't know why I felt so lost. But something always pulled me back to this city. It was as if I knew, unconsciously, that I belonged here, even though I couldn't remember why. The brooch you always wore, I remember clearly. I remember holding it in my hand as a child. It was the only thing I remembered because I held on to it when you left me on the streets, far away from everything I knew and loved. Victoria, you don't recognize me when you see me on the streets. It's ironic. The reason you hate beggars so much is because deep down, they remind you of what you did. Every time you see one of us, you see the child you abandoned. When you brought me into this house, into this cruel play you staged, you didn't realize you were bringing the past back. You tried so hard to bury it, but Ethan came back." Ethan turned to the bride, who stood there in shock at the revelation. "Olivia, your kindness and compassion gave me the strength to face this truth. Your act of generosity that day on the street gave me the courage to listen and help those in need. Victoria, her obsession with social status, her contempt for the less fortunate, and her cruelty disguised as life lessons, they all make sense when you look at them from a different perspective. It was all an elaborate cover to hide your past and what you did to me and my father. But no more. The truth has been exposed and you can no longer hide behind your lies and schemes. It is time for you to face the consequences of your actions. From this day forward, I do not stand here as a broken man that you think you can use in your schemes, but as Ethan Howard, reclaiming his identity and rightful place in this world. I am here to see that justice is finally done." As Ethan finished speaking, the church erupted into chaos. Olivia stood there, tears streaming down her face as the full impact of Ethan's words hit her. Victoria was pale and shaking, as if she were shrinking under the weight of the truth being revealed. Robert pulled away from his wife, shocked by the revelation, as if looking at her for the first time and not liking what he saw. In the days after the dramatic revelation at the church, the lives of everyone involved were drastically changed. Ethan, determined to prove his identity beyond doubt, took a DNA test on a distant relative of the Howard family. Tension was high as everyone waited for the results. On a sunny afternoon, Ethan, Olivia, and Robert gathered at the family law office. The envelope containing the test results was opened with trembling hands. "The results are positive," the lawyer announced, his voice echoing in the stunned silence of the room. "Ethan is definitely Jonathan Howard's dead son." Olivia squeezed Ethan's hand, tears of happiness and relief sparkling in her eyes. Robert, still processing everything, placed a comforting hand on Ethan's shoulder. Finally, after all these years, the truth is out. It's nice to take the blinders off and see that no matter what happens, we can still be happy. Ethan whispered, his voice choked with emotion. The consequences for Victoria were swift and severe, accused of fraud, manipulation, and possibly even involvement in Jonathan Howard's death. She faced a lengthy legal battle. The police arrived at the mansion with a search and seizure warrant. Victoria, still in a state of shock, looked around as the officers searched every room, seizing documents, computers, and even her precious brooch, now a vital piece of evidence. Eager to make an example of someone as influential as her, prosecutors ramped up their investigation into Jonathan's mysterious death, which had been ruled an accident years earlier. The high society that had once celebrated her now shunned her, as if she were a plague. Victoria's social empire crumbled as quickly as it had been built. Her phone stopped ringing, invitations to charity events and fancy dinners disappeared in an instant. Old friends turned their backs on her, refusing to have any further contact. As people come across her on the streets, fearing that any association with her could tarnish her reputation, Victoria's assets are frozen while the investigations continue, depriving her of the resources she once considered limitless. The mansion she turned into a personal castle now resembles a glittering prison, with reporters camped outside its doors, eager to catch a glimpse of the society matriarch's diminished image. But in a twist of irony, Victoria finds herself alone and isolated, experiencing some of the same powerlessness she inflicted on Ethan years ago. As the evidence mounts and more details of her manipulations are revealed, it becomes clear that she faces not only social exclusion but also the risk of spending years in prison. Meanwhile, Ethan and Olivia grow closer, tested by the adversity they have overcome together. They held an intimate wedding ceremony, completely different from the performance Victoria had planned. In the vows, Olivia took her husband's hand and said, "How about using our wealth to help people who are in the same situation as you were?" Ethan's eyes were bright with emotion and determination. "Nothing makes me happier, my love. Let's turn this tragedy into something positive." From there, they began a new journey, building a brighter future from the hardships of the past.